Welcome, everyone. It's good to see you on this Friday. Today, we'll be exploring the various themes that we've been engaging over the course of the semester with our esteemed guest, Attorney James E. Ferguson II, who is here to help us think about how the African-American freedom struggle since World War II connects not only to Asheville, but also to some of the broader topics that we've been dealing with thus far. So Mr. Ferguson was born into the Jim Crow South right here in Asheville, North Carolina. While in high school, Mr. Ferguson worked with fellow students to form the Asheville Student Committee on Racial Equality, also known as ASCORE. This group of high school students was successful in desegregating department store lunch counters and other public facilities of Asheville, including the libraries and the recreation parks. ASCORE was reputedly known as the only high school group of its kind at the time. As the first president of ASCORE, Mr. Ferguson attended the founding meeting of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in Raleigh, North Carolina in 1960. Just 3 short years after graduating from Columbia University Law School in the late 1960s, Mr. Ferguson prosecuted one of North Carolina's most well-known criminal trials, made famous in the book and full-length movie, Blood Done Signed My Name. 2 years later, he defended the Wilmington 10, a world-renowned case involving America's first political prisoners of conscience as declared by Amnesty International. 40 years later, he was successful in gaining pardons of innocence for each of the Wilmington 10. He was also successful in achieving a judicial declaration of innocence for Darrell Hunt, who spent 20 years in prison following his wrongful conviction of rape and murder. Mr. Ferguson can be seen in the Darrell Hunt documentary entitled The Trials of Darrell on HBO. Recently, Mr. Ferguson obtained a commutation from death sentences to life imprisonment for the only 4 people whose cases were decided under North Carolina's Racial Justice Act, the only law of its kind in the nation. He has been included in every edition of the Best Lawyers in America. He was featured in the National Law Journal as one of the top 10 litigators in the country. He was featured in the Charlotte Observer as the lawyer lawyers come to see. He has been recognized as a super lawyer by Super Lawyers magazine. And he is also a member of the coveted Inner Circle, a group of 100 of the best plaintiffs lawyers in the country. Please welcome Attorney James Ferguson.
Thank you, Professor Harvey, for that warm introduction. And good morning to all of you. It is a pleasure for me to be with you today. Asheville, as you may have gathered, has a special place in my heart. It happens to be the place where I was born and where I grew up, and where my experience with the whole issue of race, which continues to dominate and permeate American law, was born. Before I get into the topic of today that I'm told I should talk about, I want to just let you know that I have a special friend of mine who is joining me in the audience today. We've been friends since childhood, and I didn't believe him when he called me up the other day and said he was coming to the lecture. He was one of the founders of the group ASCORE that Professor Harvey mentioned in his introduction. So right here at the beginning, I just want you to meet my friend and colleague and one of Asheville's greatest citizens, Marvin Chambers. Thank you. Now, I'm quick to tell you at the outset, this is not the first and only lecture I've done here at UNC Asheville. On occasions, I come up and I teach a class on civil rights. I think the last time I did it was in 2016, and we may do it again. But the topic that we're talking about today is the African-American struggle for freedom since World War II. And as all of you know, World War II ended around mid-century of the 20th century. It ended at a time when apartheid, racial apartheid here in America, was in full bloom. There were some folks who thought that it either ended or would end with the Emancipation Proclamation of 1865, and of course it should have. And maybe, if you're the extreme optimist, maybe it ended for a little while after the end of the Civil War, but not for long. And I won't go into the long and sordid history of Reconstruction in America, but no sooner than the war was declared over and the proclamation of emancipation was issued, resistance and revenge in the South took hold. And lo and behold, before we knew it, what few gains had been made as a result of the Civil War had been taken away, culminating in a way in the decision of Plessy versus Ferguson in 1898, when the highest court in the land said that separate but equal is the law of the land. Keep in mind that this is the same Supreme Court that had said about 45 years earlier in 1854, I believe it was, in the Dred Scott decision, that no black man has any rights that a white man is bound to respect. So that's sort of where we start from when we move forward to the end of World War II in 1945. And at that time, when most of you were neither born nor conceived, we lived an apartheid life in America, and particularly in the South of America, and right here in Asheville, North Carolina. When I have traveled to South Africa, where I've been fortunate to travel and do some teaching in earlier years, I'm always reminded that as appalled as Americans seemed to be with South African apartheid, my face-to-face confrontation with South African apartheid simply reminded me of my childhood here in Asheville, where I grew up, as did other African Americans of that era, under American Ashevillean apartheid. Everything was segregated. Schools were segregated. Housing, segregated. Virtually no African American lived in a white community in Asheville in 1945. Medical care, segregated. Public facilities, lunch counters, recreation parks, libraries, segregated. And it was not the separate but equal segregation that the Supreme Court, tongue-in-cheek, had declared in 1898. But everything was separate, but nothing was equal. And although slavery had been abolished with the 13th Amendment somewhere around 1866, the badges of slavery, the legacy of slavery remained. And it was not just that we were a legally segregated apartheid nation, but we had to endure all of the negativism that flowed from racial segregation. Separate but equal, if such a thing could have been achieved, and it couldn't, but even if it could have been, would have been difficult at best. But being separate in and of itself from one race to another does not carry with it the same deep, sinister implications as a separate but unequal apartheid. Now, by that, what do I mean? At the time of the end of the Second World War in 1945, I was 3 years old. I was born in 1942. And at about 3 years old, that's when you begin to have some sense of conscience, some sense of awareness of what's around you. So at that early age, I, as did other African Americans who grew up under America's racial apartheid, grew up in an environment where everything that surrounded you said to you, not only are you separate, but you're inferior. So it was a continuation of the tenet of white supremacy that characterized American slavery from its beginning and throughout. Because when I became aware of my neighborhood, which was an all-black neighborhood, and learned that there were other neighborhoods that were all white neighborhoods, the one thing that stood out was that the white neighborhoods were superior, the black neighborhoods were inferior. Likewise, when I got a little older and went to elementary school, I went to an all-black elementary school because under the law that was required at the time. So it was not just a separate school from where my white counterparts attended. It was an inferior separate school. So everything that was separated and segregated by law carried with it not just the implication of separateness, but also the clear implication of inferiority. So without listing all of the things in society that one might think about, and you just think about any aspect of it, and it's there, essentially I grew up under a system of apartheid that said to me in my every waking moment that you are inferior because everything that you are associated with is inferior. So when I looked in the mirror, then what I saw was an inferior human being according to those standards of society. Now, did I know at that time that I was being told by everything I encountered that I was inferior? No. As a matter of fact, in my family and in my neighborhood, I was told the opposite, that you're just as good as the next one. But when someone tells you that, and everything that surrounds you says the opposite, at some point, it no longer has the ring of truth. But it is important to note that at the same time, I and my contemporaries were being told by society that everything about you is inferior. My white counterparts were being told the exact opposite. They were being told by everything surrounding them that they were superior. So when we talk even today about the concept and the premise of white superiority, we're not necessarily talking about somebody just deciding one day that they are superior, but we're talking about a society that said to one group was white, you are superior, and said to another group, you are inferior. So there's nothing that's inherently evil about someone feeling that way. It's almost that you can't escape it. And so when we hear people talk today about white supremacy and white privilege, it all stems from a long and sordid history that said to whites you are superior, that said to blacks that you are inferior. So in that sense, it would have been unusual for whites to think that they were not superior. Just as it would have been unusual for African Americans to think that they were not regarded as inferior by society, but more, not just regarded, but to have been affected and have some doubt about your own superiority because society would not allow you the luxury of escaping that. Now, for myself, and I'm not going to talk about myself very much more, but I want to say this. I grew up under the segregated system of schools where all of my teachers and all of my schoolmates were white. And at some point when I began to realize that I had been a product of this system of apartheid, then I could not help but have some doubts about whether I had the education that I needed to have, whether I had developed the skills that I needed to develop to cope in society, to cope in law school. Having gone all the way through elementary school, secondary school, and college under a system of apartheid, when I left the South to go to law school at Columbia University, I could not help but wonder, am I as prepared as my white counterparts for this next venture? Am I going to be affected by the education that I have had, by the orientation that I have had, by all of the things that for a lifetime I had encountered that said to me, you are inferior? And so if I'm honest with you, I have to tell you, I had some doubt. And it took some time to overcome that doubt because we don't readily or easily escape from the things that are inculcated in us on a daily basis, on an hourly basis, on a minute-by-minute basis. So that when I come to you today to talk with you about the African American freedom struggle since World War II, I'm talking to you about not just a struggle to overcome segregation, not just a struggle to overcome apartheid, but a struggle to overcome all that one experiences where everything in society says to you, you are inferior. You're not equal to your counterparts. And we still encounter that today. So when we go back to 1945, at the end of World War II, we're looking at a country which has been steeped in the apartheid of inequality. But when we talk about the end of World War II, we have to think about World War II itself and what it was about and what World War II meant to the African American freedom struggle here at home. And I looked at a book that's dated now, but it's a book called An American Dilemma, written by Gunnar Myrdal. Dr. Myrdal was from Sweden, but he'd come here to America and done a study of race, racism, and race relations in America. And he published a 2-volume book, and sometimes when you have nothing else to do, you might want to take a look at it. It's called An American Dilemma by Gunnar Myrdal. But in that book, Dr. Myrdal made an observation about what was happening in America in 1942. And he noted an editorial from the New York Times dated April 3rd, 1943, I believe. I'm going to try to read just a quote for it. It's hard to read under these bright lights they gave to me. But at that time, the New York Times editorial said, if the United Nations win this war, the principle of the worldwide legal equality of races will have to be recognized. Since this is largely a war of ideas, and since racial equality before the law has become one of the central ideas on the Democratic side, we can almost say that this principle in itself may be the deciding factor. The Chinese, the East Indians, the numerous African peoples, and many other groups are on our side, or would be so, if they were completely convinced that we mean what we say by equality, just as unreservedly as the Nazis mean what they say by inequality. But we Americans cannot very well talk convincingly in these terms unless we prove our sincerity in our own country. Our largest recognizable racial minority is the Negro. So the New York Times was saying that this war has implications for the issue of race in America. Remember, this was just a few decades after Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois had made the observation that the defining factor for the 20th century in America is and will be the color line. So here we begin to see this color line beginning to have implications beyond just America, but having international implications. And we'll see as we go along that those international implications have played and continue to play a role in how we conceive ourselves. And interestingly enough, and ironically enough, around that same time, a man named Wendell Willkie, who at the time was the head of the Republican Party, made this observation. Today, it is becoming increasingly apparent to thoughtful Americans that we cannot fight the forces and ideas of imperialism abroad and maintain a form of imperialism at home. The war has done this to our thinking. So we are finding, under the pressures of this present conflict, the long-standing barriers and prejudices are breaking down. The defense of our democracy against the forces that threaten it from without have made some of its failures to function at home glaringly apparent. Our very proclamation of what we are fighting for have rendered our own inequities self-evident. When we talk of freedom and opportunity for all nations, the mocking paradoxes in our own society become so clear that they can no longer be ignored. So what Wendell Willkie was saying is that we can not only look at what's going on in the United States when we assess our racial problems, but we've got to look now at what's going on internationally, because we are now being viewed as a factor in the world. And if we're going to be fighting wars against inequality, then we've got to look at our own inequality at home. So in that sense, in many ways, World War II was a turning point in the way that Americans, and when I talk about Americans, I'm talking about all Americans, white and black, began to look at the whole issue of race. Now bear in mind that at the end of the Civil War, 80 years earlier, many people were feeling that we are now going to get beyond this issue of race that has divided us and plagued us as a country. But this was 80 years later, and we're talking still about a country being divided by race. But at the end of World War II, there was a great deal of optimism on the part of African Americans themselves and on the part of many white Americans who also wanted to see an end to the racism that had characterized this country from its inception. But as we'll see, as we look at what happened after World War II, that issue of race still was not solved by the events of World War II or the events at home. Keep in mind that near the end of World War II, African Americans were welcomed into the armed forces because they were needed in the effort to win the war and bring it to conclusion. So it was during that period of time that our armed services became racially integrated. So one might have thought in this circumstance and amidst this optimism that America would see the end of the legacy of slavery. America would see the end of its racism. America would see the end of white supremacy. America would see the end of black inferiority. And for a while it looked like it might, because there was a flurry of activity taking place in the States after the war. We had commissions who were studying racial equality, a commission appointed by President Truman. We had a very active NAACP. We had the courts getting involved. We had African Americans increasing their numbers on the voting rolls. You had African Americans in roles that they'd never been in before. We had African American federal judges and 1 or 2 state judges. We had African Americans getting elected to Congress. So it looked like for a moment that something might change. But it only looked like change because when we go back and we take stock, not very much actually changed during that time. You may remember that it was during this time that a small band of lawyers in the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, as it was known at that time, were winding their way to try to have the highest court in the land, this same court that said that separate but equal was all right in 1898, and had said that no black man has any rights that a white is bound to respect 100 years earlier in 1852, that was moving towards getting the Supreme Court of the United States to outlaw racial segregation. And so they put cases together, and somewhere around 1952, 5 of those cases reached the United States Supreme Court, culminating in the decision by the United States Supreme Court in 1954, known as the Brown versus Topeka, Kansas Board of Education, where the Supreme Court reversed itself, reversed what it had said in 1852, reversed what it had said in 1898, and said separate but equal is no longer the law of the land. Henceforth, schools can no longer separate and segregate students on the basis of race. My friend Marvin Chambers and I were in about the 7th or 8th grade at that time. And I remember thinking, wow, this is great news. I remember talking with my 8th grade teacher, a woman named Annabelle Logan, and saying, Miss Logan, does this mean that we're now going to have a better school? That we can now go to Randolph Junior High School if we want to? And that when I go to high school next year, I can go to Lee Edwards if I choose to? That no longer am I going to be separated and segregated by race and called inferior by race? And she, being the wise teacher that she was, said, we'll see. And we did see. And as anxious as I was to see an end to this segregated system, which I was now recognizing the negative effects of, nothing happened in 1954 to change anything. Being the optimist that I am, I said, okay, well, it'll happen next year. And nothing happened. And the next year, nothing happened. And throughout high school, nothing happened. The schools in Asheville remained virtually as segregated after the Supreme Court decision in Brown in 1954 as it did before that time. So that by the time of my senior year in high school, nothing having happened, I got together with my friends, Marvin Chambers and a few others who were seniors at Stevens Lee. And we said, it's time to do something. So about that time, the school board, recognizing that something needed to be done, had decided to make some so-called improvements at Stevens Lee High School. Well, we said, no, that's not going to do it. What needs to be done is if you're not going to allow us to go to school together, the least you can do is give us a school that's equal to Lee Edwards. And we went to the superintendent with our protests. And the superintendent said, no, we're going to do for you what we said. We're going to make 1 or 2 improvements. We're going to give you a track at the school there, but there wasn't enough room to build a track for racing. And we're going to improve your gym, and we're going to do this, that, or the other. So we said, well, Mr. Superintendent, we appreciate that, but that's not going to do. We think that under the law, we're entitled to have a school. First of all, we're entitled to go to any school we want to, and we're entitled at least to have a school that's equal to this university campus that they got down in Stevens at Lee Edwards. So he said, no, we're not going to do that. So we said, okay. What we'll do is we'll just lead a march from Stevens Lee, and we'll have all the students at Stevens Lee go down to Lee Edwards. And within a few days, they changed their mind. And the school board said, well, we will do more. We're going to build you another high school. And they built a high school, not equal to Lee Edwards, but they built a high school right down the street here on French Broad Avenue, which was supposed to be the equal black high school to Lee Edwards. Anything but integrating the schools, build another school, do something, but just don't integrate our schools. Eventually, as a lawyer, I had the pleasure of coming back to Asheville and handling the Asheville desegregation case, which resulted in actually the closing of that new school that they had built and integrating Lee Edwards by all students going to Lee Edwards, a single high school. And South French Broad, as that school was known, became a junior high school. But still with reluctance, still with defiance, still with a resolve not to do what the law said you should do. And that wasn't just in Asheville, but it was all over the South and eventually the North as well. That very little activity took place to carry out the mandate of the Supreme Court of the United States when it said in 1954 that separate, racially separate and unequal schools can no longer be permitted and tolerated. Well, I can tell you that in the first 10 years after Brown, very little desegregation took place anywhere, not just Asheville, not just North Carolina, not just South Carolina, but all over the South and all over the nation. Schools remained segregated. And really, it wasn't until the late 1960s that the Supreme Court said, well, we're not going to take this slow path anymore. We've got to do something more drastic. And it was in 1968 that my law firm, my partner Julius Chambers, brought a lawsuit, reopening the desegregation suit, and finally getting a court to say, not only are we saying you've got to desegregate, we're going to now tell you how to do it. So you use the same means to desegregate your schools as you use to segregate your schools. And if you were in high school when I was back in the late 50s, you would remember school buses that transported students, in some instances, 88 miles a day to maintain segregated schools. We had black students who lived in Burnsville, North Carolina, 44 miles away, who passed by white school after white school to get to the black high school at Stevens Lee to maintain segregation. And the remarkable thing about that is nobody protested that. Nobody felt that that was a problem. Nobody felt that that was wrong. Nobody felt that that was harmful to the students. It was just what you did in order to maintain that segregated system of the South. But when the courts said, when Judge McMillan said in Charlotte in 1968 that you've got to use the same means to desegregate your schools as you use to maintain segregation in the schools, there was an outcry by white parents. This is terrible. You mean my child has got to travel 5 miles a day on a school bus? And there were protests, and there was resistance, because the same means, far less drastic, were now being employed to desegregate the schools, as had been employed to segregate the schools. So there was this outcry against busing, but I can tell you that nobody was really against busing, as they called it, but what they were against was transporting children to change this time-honored sacred tradition of separate, segregated schools. So there was resistance in Charlotte. There was resistance all over the South. There was resistance in Boston, Massachusetts, when they talked about using a school bus now to desegregate a school rather than to segregate a school. So I don't want anybody thinking that somehow parents just didn't want their children on the school bus. They didn't mind their child being on the school bus so long as it was to maintain a system of segregation that had been outlawed long before by the courts. So then before we get to that, we need to know that although there was progress made after World War II to address this American dilemma that Garner Murdaugh talked about, not much changed for 20 or so years after World War II. It was in 1953, don't forget, that lynchings were still being carried out. Most of you here are probably too young to remember the case of Emmett Till, young black boy from Chicago who came south for the summer during vacations. He wound up, I think it was the Tallahatchie River, floating in the Tallahatchie River, because he had said something, they say, to a white woman that a black youngster was not supposed to say. And somebody took care of Emmett Till. And his mother insisted that his beaten and brutalized, bloated body be displayed in an open casket because she didn't want to hide what had taken place in the South. And so we had lynchings taking place in America after World War II on a regular basis. 7 or 6 or 10 or 12 a year, you would read about, you would hear about lynchings in this so-called desegregated America. And some of you will remember hearing about February 4th, 1960, when a group of students, black students at A&T College in Greensboro, decided they weren't going to take it anymore. So they went to Woolworth's and they sat down to get a soda and a hot dog and a hamburger, and they were not served. And they were eventually turned away. And some were arrested because young African American students on college campuses decided that it was time for some real change. And so the sit-in movement started. And that was not confined to college campuses, but it happened in at least one high school, and that was the one here in Asheville. Well, Marvin and I and some of our friends decided that we too wanted to be a part of this movement that was taking place to change America. And so college students brought about that eventual change. And soon after, lunch counters began to serve African Americans who wanted a hot dog or a hamburger, but not without great resistance, not without mass arrests, and not without world opinion being focused on America and what was happening in the American South when you had Bull Connor and his dogs in Birmingham, Alabama, and people all over Mississippi and Georgia being hosed with fire hoses, being bitten and tormented by dogs, and being treated as inferior citizens in America. And it took all of that before we came to a point where we could even go to a lunch counter without fear. And so strong was the opposition that even in Durham, North Carolina, when we were doing testing of restaurants to see if they would serve African Americans, as I and my friends were sitting in a restaurant, and I had my back to the door, and the next thing I knew, I felt something cold on the back of my neck. And it was a white owner of that store saying, "I done told you niggas we don't serve you here. And if you don't get up and leave, I'm going to kill every damn one of you." Fortunately for us, we had decided that if we were asked to leave, we would. And we did. But the feelings against just something as so simple as human dignity were so strong and so fierce that those who resisted were willing to kill to protect a society that allowed them to have the lunch counters, allowed them to have the restaurants, allowed them to have the places to go where they could relax and enjoy life a little bit. But they were willing to kill to defend that right against the marauding African Americans as they saw it. So then the struggle for freedom after World War II was a long struggle, was a tough struggle. And in many instances, lives were put on the line, and in some instances, lives were taken. I don't need to tell you about the 4 little girls who were bombed in Birmingham and killed just because they were African Americans. I don't need to tell you about the freedom rides. I don't need to tell you about a white woman, Viola Liuzzo, who was killed in Mississippi along with another white colleague and an African-American colleague simply because they wanted to be able to exercise a simple right of going to public places and not being denied public places because of the color of their skin or because of their associates. So this is what that freedom struggle has been all about, and it continues today. So when W.E.B. Du Bois said back in the early 1900s, the defining feature of the 20th century will be the color line, he didn't know that it would be the defining feature not just of the 20th century, but of the 21st century as well. And now you have a discourse going on in America about rights. It manifests itself in terms of immigrant rights, manifests itself in terms of police brutality, it manifests itself in terms of women's rights as well. Because the rights explosion that grew out of the civil rights movement of the 60s inured not just to the benefit of African Americans, but inured to the benefit of women, inured to the benefit of children, inured to the benefit of seniors, inured to the benefit of gay Americans, transgender Americans, and inured to the benefit of all Americans. And we see today the struggle for rights still going on, not just confined to the most discriminated group in America, African Americans, but spreading to the benefit of others so that the struggle has become broader. And when we talk about rights, we talk about lots of different rights. We talk about the rights of the mentally ill, the rights of the elderly, the rights of immigrants, the rights of women, the rights of people to be who they are and to live and express themselves and to have equal treatment under the law. There are some who say that women benefited more, white women benefited more from the civil rights movement than African Americans did themselves. That's a debatable point. I don't raise it here. But I raise it simply to say that it is a universal struggle. It is an ongoing struggle that we see happening in America every day. And as it broadens, then the goal line becomes closer. But we're not there yet, and we won't be there for some time to come. Because just as we've gone forward with that struggle, we go backwards with it all the time. We went forward in 1865, and then we went backwards. We went forward with it after World War II, and then we went backwards. We went forward with it after the Public Accommodations Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968. But the struggle still goes on in spite of law after law and declaration after declaration. We make some progress and then we move back. We make some progress and then we move back. I can never forget just a few years ago when people were saying to me, the struggle is over now. We've won the civil rights battle. We have an African American president of the United States of America, so it's over now. No more discrimination. No more white superiority. No more black inferiority. You got a black president. And no sooner than we said that, and the black president was gone, we had Charlottesville, Virginia, where another president was saying there was some good white people out there in Charlottesville that day. And you have a president giving descriptions I can't even say to you of African countries. And you have now a discourse in America about who we are and what kind of country are we going to be and how are we going to treat those who see America as that land of freedom. And what are we going to do about immigrants from other countries who believed what was said on the Statue of Liberty when they gave it to us from France? Give me your tired. Give me your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. And we read and we repeat that inscription. And then we see Congress fighting day and night over an immigration bill to decide who can come to this country for freedom. And the question is asked, why do we have so many people coming from these, something I can't say countries, from Africa and the Caribbean? So is this the America that we were fighting for after the Civil War? Is this the America we were fighting for after World War II? Is this the America that we were taught to believe in after 1964 and 1965 and 1968? And is this the America that says, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free? And as I reflect on the role that race has played throughout the development of America and continues to play, and from all I can see will continue to play, I cannot help but look at not just the things that come to us as pure race, but the legacy we get from things that were done to preserve white superiority, black inferiority. And I know that when you look at yesterday's tragedy in Florida, very few among you will think that there are any racial implications in that. And there are no obvious racial implications in that mass shooting in Florida, just as there are no clear racial implications in what happened at Sandy Hook and what happened in Nevada and what happened at the mass shootings we've had at churches and restaurants, nightclubs, schools, everywhere. But I was talking to Dr. Harvey this morning, and I said, you know, I cannot help but reflect on where we are with our gun control laws in the U.S. I know people have lots of feelings about that. And I said, nobody will think that race has ever had anything to do with how we deal with gun control. But it occurred to me that there are racial implications even in that, with white people killing mostly white people. But we've seen enough of these tragedies in America, which is basically the only place that it happens the way it does, where you have someone going out, getting an AR-15 and killing tens of people, hundreds of people, and whatever. But I said, we have to keep in mind why it is that someone such as this young man, who is the accused killer in Florida, is able to go and get an AR-15 or other assault rifles. And we have to ask, why can someone accumulate the mass of weapons that the Paddock, I think his name is, had out in Nevada, and whoever it was that did Sandy Hook and all over where you have these mass killings? Why can't we have some gun control laws that protect people from these kinds of events? And what you hear the cry from the NRA and other groups that talk about gun rights, you hear them saying, but the Second Amendment says that we as Americans have a right to bear arms. And they have been able to convince the Supreme Court that they're probably right about that. But what no one thinks about is where that comes from. When you talk about the Second Amendment, which I say to you is very different from any other amendment under the Constitution, because the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments were adopted as a compromise to some extent to adopt the Constitution. Well, it protects freedom of assembly. There's nothing violent about freedom of assembly. It protects freedom of speech, nothing violent about that. Affects freedom of religion, nothing violent about that. Protects you in your home from unreasonable search and seizures, nothing violent about that. So all of these rights, and I haven't named them all, that are included in the Bill of Rights, except for the Second Amendment, do not protect you in using violence. They protect you in using something that we've always thought of as fundamental. Our right to exercise our religion as we choose, our right to speak as we choose, our right to come together and assemble and petition the government as we choose, and all those things that are protected. The right to counsel, the right to jury trial, all those things, none of those have any implications for violence. But when you come to the Second Amendment, it's different. Because when you talk about the right to bear arms, you're talking about the right to use the arms that you bear. Otherwise, why bear them? Well, the Second Amendment, at least one scholar tells us, grew out of a desire of southern states to protect themselves against slave revolts. It was in Virginia where the vote for Virginia was needed to ratify the Constitution. Because in the various states, there had been a battle going on as to whether certain states would ratify the Constitution or not. And then it came down to Virginia because by that time, 8 of the colonies or the states had voted to ratify the Constitution. But in order for the Constitution to pass, 9 needed to ratify it. And Virginia was the 9th one to consider it. And so some of the politicians in Virginia decided that it was important to make sure that under this new Constitution, we would not lose control over our state patrols to maintain peace and order from slave revolts. And so it was that in the House of Commons and in the Commonwealth of Virginia, that the debate was fierce over whether or not Virginia would ratify the Constitution. And it came down to a test of the Second Amendment. And Virginia, you may or may not know, had experienced a number of slave revolts. South Carolina had experienced slave revolts, and throughout the South, there had been slave revolts. And so the slave owners were in deathly fear of what would happen under a federal government if the states no longer had control of the militia, of the state militias. And the state militias would call out citizens who had guns, and they would put down slave revolts. So it was out of this mentality that the Second Amendment was ultimately ratified as part of the Bill of Rights. It had nothing to do with somebody walking down the street with a pistol by her side. It had nothing to do with an AR-15 that would kill hundreds of people with one shooting. It didn't have anything to do with that. But now we're told that no one can control the right of a citizen to bear arms because that's what our Constitution says we are supposed to have. I say to you, it's time for us to reflect on that. It's time for us to give serious thought to whether we really want to be the country in the world where citizens can walk up and down the street with automatic rifles and magazines of bullets to kill people on a whim, to kill children, to kill unarmed citizens. And where even citizens who have mental issues can get guns, as they have in so many of these instances. And how long are we as a country going to be held hostage to the arms industry and not be safe in our schools, not be safe in our churches, not be safe in our communities, not be safe in our nightclubs, because someone said that we have the right to bear arms as citizens. And someone, most of the people who say that never know that this right that they claim is at best a dubious right if it is a right at all, but was never intended at the time to give citizens the right to walk up and down the street with firearms of destruction and be able to kill masses of people on a whim. But such has been our obsession with race and slavery and white supremacy that we subject our citizens, our friends, our families, our neighbors to the kind of mayhem that we see over and over and over again, and nothing happens to change it. No one is bold enough and big enough to say, enough, we need to do something different. But not to digress, we come back to where we started from, and that is that the struggle for freedom continues in our time, and I fear for the foreseeable future. But that is not to say that we give up the struggle, because it is only through struggle that we make the strides toward freedom that ultimately, we believe, will free us as a nation. I thank you for your time.